So again, welcome to our presentation today of Advocacy 101, Strategy and Data to Tell Your Story. These are just the few slides that you will see as being an attendee of this GoToWebinar. So this is the interface, which is made up of two parts. You'll see that there's a viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything that the presenters we will be sharing on the screen. And there's a control panel on the right-hand side. Within this control panel are all the pieces that will allow you to participate in today's event. So let's have a look at that. So when we click on the orange arrow here, you can open and close your control panel. From the view menu, you can also set the control panel to not auto-hide when inactive if you prefer to keep it open at all times. The audio pane, which you see here, provides information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. However, you may choose to dial in via phone. And we currently have all attendees muted. We will unmute everyone at the end of the call of the webinar for the Q&A session that we will reserve for the end of the presentation. Okay, so here's where you can click to use the telephone, and if you select Use Telephone, the dial-in information will be displayed with a unique audio pin, as you can see here. If you have any questions, you can also populate a question. You can raise your hand through this function that you'll see here on the control panel, and submit text questions also through the chat box. Again, as I mentioned before, the Q&A will be reserved for the last 15 minutes of today's webinar. And thank you again for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Whitney Kimball-Coe from the Center for Rural Strategies. She wants to share some information leading up to the Advocacy Day that the National Rural Assembly will be hosting on September 10th. Take it away, Whitney.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. A big thank you to the National Congress of American Indians for hosting this webinar. We're looking at Rural Advocacy 101. So we're doing something a little bit different this year with the 2015 National Rural Assembly. We have added on an Advocacy Day to our time together in D.C. The meeting will take place at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, which is across the street from the Capitol. So we decided it would make sense to do some Hill visits and some other work on Capitol Hill at some point during our meeting. So September 10th, at the end of the meeting, we will, on that final day, spend some time talking to White House Rural Council officials. We'll also be doing a congressional briefing on rural child poverty up at the Senate building, the Russell Senate building. And then some of you may have registered to do some Hill visits. So those visits will start around 1 p.m. on September 10th. And we're going to work with each of you to make appointments with your congressional members on both the House and the Senate side, or as it makes sense. So we're really glad that you could participate in this webinar today, and hopefully you'll learn a few tips around what it means to do Hill visits and what it means to make an ask to policymakers on the Hill, and also just a little bit more about the logistics of organizing your messaging. So if you have any questions, please email me. My email is there on this slide, whitney@ruralstrategies.org, and we look forward to seeing you on September 10th.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm going to go ahead and now introduce Denise Desiderio, who will be doing the Advocacy 101 primary training. So,
good morning, everyone, and thank you for allowing NCAI to participate in this webinar today. Before we start getting into the basics of advocacy, I think it's important to describe what advocacy actually is. And really at its core, advocating in Congress is really identifying a problem and telling your story to achieve a different result. So when you go up to the Hill, remember, basically you're telling your story and you're asking for something, an action from Congress. And with that, we'll get into some of the basics of Congress, where we're at in Congress, and how to advocate effectively. Okay. So right now, we are in the first session of the 114th Congress. Each Congress lasts for 2 years, with a new Congress beginning every January following the biannual election of House members. This current Congress was sworn in on January 6th, and it will recess in December of 2016. So that may feel like you have a lot of time to get work done in Congress this year, but we're having a presidential election next year. So that adds complications to kind of what you're going to ask for in Congress, and the politics have already started to kind of interfere with the congressional schedule, the calendar, and the activities that Congress is working on. An example of that, we've been working with some of our congressional members on introduction of some bills, and we were told in early July that anything that the senators and representatives wanted passed in this session of Congress needed to be introduced and hopefully out of committee by the end of July of this year. So although we have another year and a half remaining in this Congress, the activities are being pushed up much farther. So your timing of coming in September is very, it'll be very timely to come in September and talk about things that you want done for next year in the next Congress. So the Senate has 100 senators, and they have 6-year terms. And the House has 435 members with 2-year terms. So you might ask, we had a question about what the difference was between the Senate and the House and advocating in the Senate and the House. Your strategy is going to differ depending on who you're meeting with. In the House, there are more bills introduced and passed. And the House is much better for local issues because the congressmen are much more attuned to what's going on locally because that's really where their election base is. In the Senate, there's much slower action. They don't pass as many bills, and the Senate is known, and maybe it's because the senators will tell you this, that they're the much more deliberative process body. So an example of that is the House actually votes on about 2 times more bills every session than the Senate does. In the 113th Congress, the House voted on 1,204 bills, and the Senate approximately 657. Interestingly, of all of those votes, only 296 bills were signed into law in the 113th Congress. So the House is much more active locally, the Senate much more long-term thinking, and that will impact how you approach each body of the Congress. We had a question about committees. So each body has their own committees. They have subcommittees, and their roles depend on kind of what their jurisdiction is. Most committees will have legislative jurisdiction. They have oversight jurisdiction. They have, in the Senate, they'll hear nominations, and they also have investigatory powers. So when you go in and you're meeting with your committees, you're going to figure out kind of what you're asking for. You may be asking for the introduction of a bill. You might be asking for that committee to hold an oversight hearing, which would mostly deal with kind of bills that are already passed and the administration and how those bills are being implemented, how that's affecting you on the ground locally. You might be asking for intervention by your senator or your congressman in a local issue. So when we talk about the legislative process, your role in this process depends on kind of which body you're dealing with. You might be asking for an introduction of a bill. You might be asking for a letter of support. You might be sending in a letter expressing concerns about legislation. In many cases, what you want to do when you're coming in is you want to tell your story. When you're having these meetings, keep in mind that when you watch the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House and you watch the senators, really what they're looking for is anecdotal information from you. Senators and congressmen love nothing more than to tell stories. So when you come in and you tell your story, you're saying, here's the problem, I've identified it, here's how it's impacting me back home. And you may actually end up being a witness at a hearing. This has happened more than once when a constituent comes in, they talk about their story, and you might actually end up being a witness and telling your story in front of the full committee. If you don't get asked to be a witness, but you have something that you think is important to the conversation or the dialogue that's happening in Congress, you can also submit testimony for the record. That's something that a lot of folks don't think about. You can submit something from your organization. You can submit testimony as an individual. And each hearing record is actually, if a bill doesn't pass, and as we learned earlier, very few bills actually pass the Congress in a given year, that record that's developed from the hearing is actually where they'll start the next session. So it's really important to, if you have a certain issue that you're working on, I know that y'all are working on a lot on poverty. I know that transportation is a big issue for you. It's really important to have your views on the record for any bill or hearing that's being considered in Congress. There are opportunities to impact legislation through the markup. The transportation bill, for example, as an issue of interest, that is extended right now through October. So the Congress is going to have to take that bill up again in October. If there are changes that you want, there's still time to amend that legislation. So you might be asking your member to make amendments to the legislation. And I think the one thing to remember, so right now, most of the activity on the highway bill has been kind of coming through the Senate. But remember that once the Senate passes the bill, it's going to go to the House. So you have an opportunity at every stage of the process, again, introduction, markup, hearings, to have your voice heard in the other body. And that happens, well, every time. We had a question in reference to the webinar about who should you meet with and why do you have to meet with all the committees? Why are there so many committees? What's the jurisdiction? So when you go in and you're scheduling these meetings in your advocacy day, it's important to always meet with your delegation. So whoever your senators and your congressmen are, it's important to have that basic meeting because they'll want to know what's going on back home, but also you're going to want their support for whatever you're proposing. So while committees are important, it's also important to involve your delegation because the members of the committee will want to know what your local congressmen and senators think about any proposal that you're bringing to their attention. It's also important to meet with the committees of jurisdiction. And by that, again, going back to the example of transportation, know who you're dealing with on each committee. Transportation is one of those bills that is quite complicated. So the Environment and Public Works Committee deals with the highway bill. The Banking Committee deals with the transit part of that bill. The Finance Committee figures out how to pay for the Highway Trust Fund, and the Commerce Committee deals with the safety aspects in that bill. So that's one bill that has 4 different committees of jurisdiction. So when you go into your meetings, make sure that you know who you're meeting with and what their particular jurisdiction is so that you're making the most of your time. The other committees that you may want to deal with, a lot of times what you're talking about are budgetary concerns. Make sure to meet with the appropriators. That's a really important aspect of this because in many times you're bringing budgetary issues up to committees that have no jurisdiction over appropriations. So when we have our members come in, we always make sure that whatever issues that they're working on, that we also try to schedule meetings with the appropriators because that's really where the financing for any of your proposals comes in. And for us, we always meet with the Committee on Indian Affairs. Their jurisdiction is on tribal issues. And like you all, we have a broad range of issues that we work with each committee on. And always meet with the chair and the ranking members. We just had to switch to a Republican Congress this year. But throughout the years when the Democrats were in the majority, we always make sure to instruct all of our members to meet with both the chair and the ranking because, for one thing, power switches often in Congress. And that way, when the new majority comes in, you don't have to update them again on all of the issues that are impacting you back home. This slide This next slide talks about the congressional districts with the highest Native populations. We thought this would be interesting because I suspect there's a lot of overlap in your membership. You see that Indian country is mostly rural. The majority of our tribes have large land bases, and we're located in rural areas. And I think that there were many issues that you all are going to be focusing on come September that really impact our tribal communities as well. So when you get your meetings with your delegation, we were asked the simple question, like, what is an ask? Like when everybody talks about, know your ask. You're really only asking for a couple things. You can have an introductory meeting with your delegation or with your committee members, and that's really just you're introducing yourself, you're introducing your organization, and you're providing materials for them to get to know you as an organization better. You might be asking for legislation to be introduced, or you may be asking for amendments to current legislation. You might be asking for oversight opportunities or your financing. But always make sure that whenever you go to these meetings, that you know what your message is. One of the examples that we had a tribe come in, and all of a sudden their senator popped into the meeting and he said, "What do you need from me?" And the tribe started talking about their history. And by the time they got to about 1850, the senator had to leave. And he literally wanted to know what they wanted him to do for them, and they didn't have that one sentence soundbite, like, this is what we need from you, and we'll provide all the materials that you need. So make sure you know what your message is. It should be short, it should be succinct. Know that the staff, they have meetings probably, and the congressmen have meetings every 15 minutes to every half hour. So always make sure that you know what you're asking for. Know the difference between the House and Senate. Again, Senate's longer term, House is more parochial issues. Have a message for whether you're meeting with a Republican or a Democrat. When we meet with Republicans, a lot of our tribal folks will talk about local control, about governance, about smaller government, and letting tribes control more of the decision making locally. Know whether what you're asking for is for the Hill to do something or for them to ask the administration to do something, and tailor your message to each meeting. You should have a one-pager for each meeting that you go to, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is talk to them in person, introduce yourself, give them the information they need, but you want to always leave them with information that they can refer to later, and then discuss next steps. So when you leave that meeting, follow up. Calendar about a month out and be back in contact. If there are any activities that impact the legislation or what you're asking for oversight-wise, follow up with them. Send them your newsletters. Just always kind of keep yourself in front of them in some way or another. And I think before we turn it over to Malia, I think the most important message that we always have for our folks is that nobody can represent you better than you. Your story is your story. Just come in and tell your story. Your purpose, your main purpose, is to educate, build relationships, and always remember that policy work is long-term. Most of the impactful bills that have happened in Indian country have happened over 3 to 5 Congresses. So we're talking about 6 to 10 years is the average for how long it takes for us to get most of our legislation done. And then always consider other allies that can help you, other organizations, other coalitions, tribal governments. Find out who else is impacted by your issue and build those coalitions, because the more voices you have on an issue and the more pressure that you can build to get your legislation done. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Malia.
Thank you so much, Denise. I should note here, I meant to introduce her more properly. She's our legislative director here at NCAI, but she has an immense amount of experience on the Hill. She formerly was lead staff director for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and so she has a wonderful insight and knowledge. So I just want to thank Denise for her time, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce Malia Villegas, who is the director of the Policy Research Center here also at NCAI, of course, and she'll be speaking a bit more about using data in telling your story and leveraging some action that way. So thank you, Malia.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Denise. Good morning, everyone. My name is Malia Villegas. I am a Alutiiq Shukpiaq with family from the islands of Kodiak and Afognak in Alaska and Oahu and Lanai in Hawaii. Enrolled member of the native village of Afognak, where I also serve on the tribal council. And we are very excited to be engaging with your community and your network. Certainly come from rural contexts, and anytime we can link arms with our partners doing this critical work and to try to think together about how to meet the needs of our communities, we're very happy to do it. Before I jump in here, I just want to say that Denise and I have really, in addition to being dear colleagues and friends, have really tried to be more strategic about how we have conversations about the kinds of data and research needs that she and her team need on the Hill in order to tell the best stories, to tell it at an individual level, but to also give some of that trend line information about impact that increasingly our policymakers need, but also to feedback to their shop information that we're hearing in the field about emerging needs that can align with what they're also hearing at a national level. So it's been a really effective partnership. I think we've worked to effect around transportation issues most consistently this year, but are having another download session here soon to talk about the next 6 months kind of planning forward. So this is a real effort between the wonks and the geeks that we just want to share a little bit with you about today. So I've just got a few slides. Our shop is really not organized in the same way that the legislative shop is organized, which tends to be around topic areas. We're designed purposefully to be cross-cutting, where we focus on issues like data quality and data access that could touch on any number of topics related to policy. We do a lot of work around research regulations with tribal community. How can tribes be put in the driver's seat when it comes to the research questions and needs that they might have, as well as how to synthesize the best information and research that's out there to make it most effective in a policy context. So I just want to share a few things that we're doing here in terms of this theme that you're hearing around telling an effective story. And what we've tried to do is what we call flipping the script in order to really reduce inequality in some of our communities. So I'll start a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here with a little bit of a comic that I think tells a pretty effective story. What you see here is a grandfather and a grandson sitting in a reservation rural community. And on the radio, you hear non-white babies now outnumber white babies in America for the first time. It's a pretty large story that hit a few years ago. And Grandpa's listening, and he says second. So second time, right? And I like to start with this when we talk about data and story, because using data to effect and using our legislative resources to effect is really critical for our communities where we tend to experience erasure and invisibility. So this comic is really about the fact that, you know, there was a time in our fair lands when Native babies did outnumber white babies, but often because of the way that stories and data are told, we forget about that piece. And so it's just a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, but how critical it is to tell our own stories and to use data in that way, not just kind of random data points. Here's a slide also that really just gives you a sense of where our people tend to be at a state level. We are a national organization, but it's really critical in our board here, which is made up of 12 regions that we look at geographically. We see that there are states that have high proportions of American Indian Alaska Native populations. And so Alaska, my home state, for instance, we make up close to 18%, 18 to 20, depending on the metric that you're looking, of the state population. You know, so there's a rationale for talking to the governor there to say, you know, how is your policy and your resources meeting the needs of Alaska Natives in your catchment. But you also have others, 7 states that we're looking at here that have more than 3% of the state population is American Indian Alaska Native. And interestingly, in some of our Get Out the Native Vote work, these tend to be, in the past elections, some pretty critical states. So even though we make up a small proportion, which can tend to be be the case in terms of rural populations, you can make the case by looking at and telling your story at a state level and thinking about how to leverage relationships. And this will become important here in a moment when we talk about the kind of comparisons that can be effective in your advocacy work. So this just gives you a sense, and then there's 8 additional states where American Indians, Alaska Natives make up 1 to 3% of the state population. So these are the ones we tend to focus in on, although there are Native people in every state across. So in terms of strategies and solutions, there's a few things that we like to talk about and talk through here to think about how to leverage data and information to tell effective stories. One of the pieces is, how do we actually leverage our differences? So a lot of times in a policy context, you tend to be getting information about national level data and statistics. People want to understand how things work at a national space. But what we found with other partners, and certainly in our context, is that regional kinds of storylines and disaggregation, certainly state level, can help really bring forward the importance of place, which is pretty critical to our advocacy efforts, to talk about how geography matters, how land and environment matter, which I know is very important to many of your constituencies. And so last October, we released a series of regional data profiles for each of our 12 regions here, which are collectivities of states, to try to leverage some of our policymakers beyond the national interface. So again, how do we say to, for example, the Northwest region, governors in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, hey, Idaho, Washington is really doing a lot better at keeping their American Indian Alaska Native students in school to completion. There are some similar geography and cultural, contextual pieces that you share in this region. Are there things you can learn from what Washington State is doing with their American Indian Alaska Native population that can be leveraged? So the other piece that's really critical here in this storyline about leveraging differences is that so much of the national discourse, certainly for our population, has been about deficit and how we need to fix American Indian Alaska Native communities. And I'm sure this resonates with many of you, because I know this is a consistent storyline with rural contexts. But when you begin to start looking at regional disaggregation and regional storylines, you can begin to leverage strength in different ways instead of just talking about what's broken. And so that's the second point here that we try to emphasize, is in looking at regionality and place and pushing down disaggregation, we've developed more native to native comparisons. So a lot of times in the policy context, you'll see native to non-native comparisons, right? And this persistent gap, the education, the schooling gap, the dropout gap, the economic gap. And that can be important to talk about injustice and inequality. But we find that a lot of times that really limits the discourse about strength and seeing our communities as places where there are great things, there's innovation happening, and ways that we can leverage from one community to another about what's working well. One community is doing better at retaining teachers. One community is doing better at job creation. And how can we build those community-to-community relationships there? So that's one way that we can think a little bit about differences and leveraging those instead of always just talking about closing these persistent gaps and unfortunately framing our communities as sites of lack and deficit. A couple of the other points, linking data. So this is an emerging conversation amongst researchers, demographers, economists. It's very expensive to collect data in many of our communities, certainly in rural contexts, in terms of distance and access to large populations that you need for statistical power. So increasingly what we're seeing is a look to what's called administrative data. So for instance, when a family goes and applies for WIC or SNAP resources, they provide demographic data to the federal government. That information goes into large repositories and can be linked to other kinds of information in a, protected, and there are really critical pieces about data sharing and data linkage that we're monitoring in terms of confidentiality and security that way. But it's really critical to think about the fact that our people, our families, our kids don't just occupy or live in one set of institutions like schools. They experience, health systems, they experience juvenile justice and justice systems. So how can we do better with linking data across different topic areas and domains to understand the realities and the needs that are going on? So there is an effort here, and I think it's always important when we talk to our partners in different networks to think about institutions you folks may be working with regularly that can help you in thinking about how to frame your policy issues by thinking across data sets. So epidemiology centers are one example, tribal EPIs in particular, or public health centers, and thinking about how to leverage data institutions in your region and not just at a national level that can help you make the case that is more pertinent to your place and in your region that way. So that's one strategy. And then the third that we've been increasingly encouraged and wanting to do more, NCAI has done quite a bit over time about the tribal-state relationship. Again, we are a national organization, but so much of the effective implementation of policy really relies on coordination across multiple jurisdictions, across different government-to-government relationships. And so we had a tribal-state session at our last conference in St. Paul, Minnesota, at our mid-year conference. And one of the big points of feedback from tribal leaders there was that in addition to the tribal state discussion, we need to be doing more about tribal county and state county conversations, again, to think about how health resources, for instance, are doled out to counties but may not be making it to tribal entities because of a lack of effective data. So we keep coming back to some of this piece about the data infrastructure and the data needs at that level. So these are just a few points, things that we encounter in our day-to-day work that we wanted to put on the table for you, as partners, but as you begin to think about the kinds of conversations that may come up with policymakers and that may either enable or constrain some of your work to make sure that your advocacy can have the greatest impact. So a couple of quick slides here that just make the case that I just shared with you. This is a persistent kind of gap image that we see. It to some extent doesn't even really matter where we're at in terms of the context. We know the gap. This is a different way we've tried to break some of this out. This is old data, but it shows if we were just looking at the rate of Alaska Natives living in poverty by region, this is in the state of Alaska, you'd get one figure, 20%, right? This was in 2000, compared to on the left side of the screen, statewide at that time, 7% of non-natives were living in poverty. So there's the gap, 20% compared to 7%. But what we did was we broke out this poverty metric by what's called ANCSA region, Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which is an act related to settling Aboriginal land claim in Alaska. And looked at these. So these are also cultural boundaries and linguistic boundaries. And what we find is a lot more range. And so we could look at a place like Arctic Slope or Aleut region, where you only have 11 or 12% of poverty. What can we learn about what's going on in those regions to leverage to a place like Atna or Chilista or Doyon in terms of how to understand the poverty needs and identify that these are also places of great strength that we could learn from. So by disaggregating regionally, and this is the same kind of notion on this next slide, which looks at high school graduation rates by ethnicity and by ANCSA region, again in Alaska, the gap is not the same, right? You begin to see peaks and valleys, places like Chugach right in the middle where there's a lot closer graduation rate for Alaska Natives and all students. What can we learn there that we could take to a place like Chilista where there's really persistent lower graduation rates? So again, it's about identifying strengths through using comparisons in some different ways. And then the last slide here, just a different context besides education, is about juvenile justice. So what you see is on the left, so these are our 7 states with high populations of American Indians, Alaska Native people, as I suggested earlier. And you see the proportion or percentage that are residing in juvenile justice facilities in those states as a total, and then the American Indians, Alaska Natives, that are residing in those facilities. And then you see the proportion of AIN or Native youth who are in the total population. So what we would expect, right, given the numbers, this is what we would expect. And then you see the percent difference. And you see the striking numbers in North Dakota, for instance, 240% higher than we would expect. Our Native youth being in the juvenile justice facilities, given their representation in the total state population. But then you see a place like New Mexico and Arizona, significantly lower than we would expect. So what can we learn again from Arizona and New Mexico in this particular time period? We haven't run this recently, that we could share with North Dakota, or to begin to leverage some of our state policymakers about what might be happening at a state level for our youth to do it a little differently. So again, it's not just about we got to get the data point, it's how do we use the data to tell stories, but also to hold governments accountable for meeting the needs of our communities at that level. So just a little bit, there's kind of our final thank you slide, but I think we wanted to make sure to leave good time here for some Q&A. Denise and I and the whole team are here, but we'll end there.
Great. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you again, ladies, for wonderful insights on both fronts. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute folks. If anyone has any questions, they can either type it into the chat or just feel free to share with us. So, or you can also use the raise your hand function to let us know you have a question. Anyone in this room have a question? No? So there was a quick question just about whether or not this we will be able to email out a copy of this PowerPoint, and we will easily do that. We have the registration list, so if you included a email in that, which I believe everyone was required to do, we will be able to ensure that you receive it. We've been recording this webinar, and we'll be posting it on our website. Okay, so I'm unmuting folks. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask of Denise or Malia about how to go about advocating at Congress when you have this meeting coming up around the corner.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah. You mentioned discussing next steps when you're asking a committee for whatever issue that is you're asking for, and I was wondering with the follow-up emails, is there a fine line between a professional sort of follow-up or you're pestering them?
That's a good question. We had a question about next steps and not leaving a meeting without next steps, and kind of where you cross the line into kind of from professionalism into pestering. I don't think there's a set rule, but I think there's one of the things I mentioned is just like providing them with information. So keeping yourself in front of a congressional person or a committee or a representative. You know, partly you could say, I was wondering if there's a timeline for introduction. I was wondering, you know, if the letter got sent, interspersing those emails with here's a newsletter that articulates kind of what's going on in our community, or here's a newspaper article about the issue that we talked about. So it's kind of a give and take where you're providing them with information, but also asking in return for status updates.
Great, thank you, Denise. Okay, I'm going to check on here, see if we have any more questions.
Can we ask them a question?
Yeah, of course.
Maybe we could ask the participants a question about the issues that they feel like they're going to be advocating for when they come here in September, any particular issues, or of any examples of relationships or work that they're doing with the tribal governments in their areas.
Whitney, could you speak to some of the primary top-line issues at all?
Oh, sure. So the primary focus of the 2015 National Rural Assembly will be around addressing rural child poverty and looking to programs that we know are working or are making some difference in rural communities across the country. Some of those are like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. Both of those credits are up for expiration in 2016, and it's going to be a fight to keep them on indefinitely. So that will be one of the topics addressed. Also, food access, things around food access and programs within the Farm Bill will definitely come up. But a lot of what we'll be doing is telling stories. So you were talking a good bit about anecdotal sharing that goes on the Hill and how powerful that can be. The Assembly is going to be really built around a lot of storytelling from the Delta, from Indian country, from Appalachia, from some of the areas where there's the most concentrated poverty. So they will be talking about, these panels will be talking about what it looks like and what they are doing about it. I imagine that we will have a number of issues come up while we're meeting in DC that will make it to Hill visits, whether it's in individualized Hill visits or in the congressional briefing, which we're going to be hosting in the Kennedy Caucus Room in the Russell Senate Building with Senator Stabenow's office will be in attendance. And she's the ranking member on the Senate Ag Committee. We hope that Thad Cochran's office will be in attendance as well, and they will be bringing a number of staffers with them.
And we're happy as well to reach out to the House and Senate Indian Affairs committees because it might be something of interest to them as well if you think their participation
That's great.
is helpful.
That's great. One of our panelists will be Nick Tilson from Thunder Valley CDC, and he'll be talking about how they're using culture, youth opportunity, and food to address poverty in the Pine Ridge Reservation. That'll be an interesting story.
Great, thank you so much, Whitney. We have been receiving a couple audience questions. So one that came up was, how far ahead of time are Hill visits best scheduled? Any tips for newbies on doing that?
Yes, and we have our own event in September called Tribal Impact Days. And so about a month out, which I think you are at least now, you should be sending your request in to the scheduler. The scheduler is the person who's going to make the determination on the meeting. So find out the scheduler in each office. If you don't know, just call the office and they'll give you that name and email. Pretty much all the meetings now are handled by email. So you'll email in your request and kind of the topic that you're interested in and who will be attending. And the reason for that, it seems a little intrusive, to kind of know ahead of time who's going to be meeting, but each staffer will prepare a meeting memo for the senator or congressman about the meeting and about the issues to give them background on the meeting before it happens. So as much information as you can provide in the email about attendees, your time availability, and who you're requesting the meeting with is important. And something that we didn't cover in the initial presentation, don't be offended if you're meeting with staff. It's sometimes hard when you come across the country and you're coming in to meet with your senator, your congressman, but their schedules, sometimes their days are filled up with hearings or with caucus meetings and other activities. So when you come in, maybe that staff is the only person available, and that's fine too, because the congressional person is going to want a briefing on all the meetings that the staff had that week or that day. So it's a starting point, and it's great if you can get the senator or the congressman there, but if not, it's not time wasted at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's another question on, are various related or linked issues such as education, broadband, immigration better kept separate in advocacy asks, or are linkages helpful?
I think it's important. Linking is helpful if you're talking about, like what you're talking about here with transportation, education, broadband. I would link that all into infrastructure issues. Sometimes when we're going up, we'll kind of say these are the infrastructure needs that we have. But again, it depends who you're meeting with. If you're meeting with a committee with specific jurisdiction, keep your oral presentation to what they can affect. But feel free to provide other written materials. If you're meeting with your delegation, hit them with everything. Everything that's important to you. Sometimes I'll have one-pagers on each issue so that you can provide the most information to them on every issue that's important. But again, know who you're meeting with. Your delegation should know everything that's important. And because if you do meet with a committee and they're going to take action on something, again, your delegation can be very helpful in supporting your efforts.
And this is Whitney, and I will say that the National Rural Assembly is built around linking all of these issues to get them out of their silos and also to strengthen each of them. Broadband and education is a really good example of how the conversation around broadband access is often being driven, is making sure that there's a clear linkage between how kids are learning nowadays and what they need, and making sure they've got broadband access in their communities. You can also imagine that there are all kinds of other combinations around agriculture and food, and certainly poverty is a cross-topical issue.
Yeah, I think that's right for us as well, and even education, something that folks don't think about much for tribal communities is housing's linked in with that too, because we're in the rural areas. If we don't have housing opportunities for teachers, it's hard to get teachers that will come and stay on the reservations and kind of become part of the local community.
And Whitney, if I could ask a quick question, are there going to be talking points that are provided to Rural Assembly participants who are coming to DC for these visits, or is that mostly for them to develop and vet with the broader group?
Yes, we will provide general talking points, sort of national conversational talking points, but you should come prepared. If you plan on visiting a congressional member or with a committee, you should come prepared with some specific talking points from your community or from within your organization. But I think what we found is that it is helpful to be able to say, I'm with the National Rural Assembly, and the National Rural Assembly focuses on all of these issues, and there's a huge coalition of people out there who are working on the same issues that I'm working on. But let me tell you a little bit about my community and how this is playing out. So that's kind of the focus, but we will have talking points when you arrive in your registration packet.
Great, thank you, Whitney. There was another question that Summer, Ms. Sage, raised. How do you handle getting data from rural communities when responses are typically low and most data is collected via online surveys? She is currently working on a needs assessment survey for access to services in rural communities, and there's this concern about small sampling sizes being too small to be significant. This is a challenge that we run across commonly, very frequently, through our work here at the Policy Research Center and among our other national advocates in collecting and harnessing some data that would be important at a national scale. And so typically there are a couple different ways to approach this. When you're working locally and you're dealing with these smaller populations, we would really strongly advocate more qualitative approaches. We find that a lot of, such as interviewing and digging more into some of those stories that you can pull out and kind of map out some trends and this sort of thing. And we've also leaned heavily on national data. We also have broken it down into regional. We've developed regional profiles, and in that way you can show, again, a bit of what Malia was referring to, where states are doing well versus where states are struggling to support Native or rural communities broadly. So these are a few ways that you can think about it. You know, we work a lot with census data as it allows you to get more down to local and county units. We're able to pull out data at the reservation level. It's still limited, but it's something that we've been working with. It certainly is a challenge. Very often we refer to what is, you know, an asterisk nation. You'll see these reports, and unfortunately you'll see for tribal members, there's an asterisk saying too small to be significant, was not included in this analysis, alongside other racial ethnic categories. And that's particularly problematic given the work that we need to do around the trust responsibility, and because tribes not only have you know, racial identification, but also a political status. And so that's something that is yes, a constant challenge, and we would love to talk to you more about that, Summer, and try to get some resources out to you to support the work that you're doing around this needs assessment. So hopefully, I don't know if we...
And I would say,
yeah.
This is Whitney. I would say that at the National Rural Assembly this year, we'll be having a breakout session specifically on data and research and how to find it and use it effectively on behalf of rural communities. So in that breakout will be the Housing Assistance Council, and they've done a lot of great research, and I'm sure some of it is around needs data. So I think that would be an excellent session to consider attending while you're there.
Absolutely. Yeah, with the online surveys, we do find that there is very little uptake, or you know, there's attrition. You have to really structure it so that it's succinct, but then you might not get the finer grained details that you're looking for. We've resorted to phone surveys. Sometimes that's an easier way to reach people, but then again, you don't want to take too much of their time because folks are busy. So it's a constant challenge. So I'm glad that this is something that will be addressed at the Assembly. So we have a couple more minutes left, and I'm going to go ahead and open the floor again to any further questions. Again, this will be recorded, and we will be distributing the slides to each participant. So here's another one. Some advocacy experts recommend watering down the ask to a level that I find drastic and even inaccurate oversimplification. Can you address the importance of simple asks in terms of more complex issues? It's hard.
Yeah, that is hard. But it's, in a way, I mean, that is the most effective ask. Usually, it's something that folks can do if it is kind of simple and very direct. And I was thinking about, like I mentioned before, the earned income tax credit ask. That is a national ask. And it just asks your congressional member to please keep that in place. It's already an allocated credit and something that we plan for. It's coming up for expiration. So that's a very simple ask. But if you're thinking of something broader, just on behalf of rural America, when we were looking at developing the congressional briefing on rural child poverty, one of our asks is that child poverty ought to be a legislative priority. Look in your dockets and see how you're addressing this. Are you addressing this? And then tell a story about why it's important in your community, to us all as a nation. But just this should be a priority. That's a simple ask.
And I think it's two-pronged. I think the asks really are generally simple. You're either asking for them to do something legislatively, like Whitney said, keep a law in place, reauthorize, introduce new legislation, hold an oversight hearing, write a letter. So the ask itself generally is going to be simple, and you should be able to say that in one sentence. It doesn't mean that your materials can't be very comprehensive, even on a complicated issue. So it really is kind of the trifecta. It's like a simple ask with good background information, and anecdotal information is probably the best packet that you can leave with congressional folks. But don't, although the ask is simple, don't shy away from complicated issues, because that's what you're living with. So taxation is a complicated issue, but the folks that you're going to be meeting with are specialists, especially the committee staff. The finance committee will get it. So, and, sometimes your delegations are spread very thin on a number of issues, but there are experts, that they can work with on these issues.
Absolutely. And I think that was something that was really revelatory to us within the Policy Research Center, is that as Denise mentioned, submitting things to the legislative record, it's often the staffers that are going back and producing these summaries when the hearings come up in the future. And a lot of academics and researchers are not aware that they can submit their articles to the legislative record directly, and that then the staffers are, kind of required in a sense to go through and get a good grasp and good knowledge of what has been done, what is available. So those are a few things, but definitely, the issues will always be complex, but the asks have to be drilled down into more precise things, and you may have to tackle a broader strategy through in a more piecemeal fashion, and kind of gauge what the politics of the moment are, and what's the low-hanging fruit. We talk about that a lot here. So,
and one thing, let the Senate or the House negotiate away issues. Don't do it yourself. Ask for what you need and let the negotiations happen there. Don't give away things before you ask for them.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, if there are no further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. We want to thank you all for your time. I've learned a lot from this webinar, frankly, and I'm thankful that we were able to partner with the National Rural Assembly in pulling this together. We hope it will be of use as you come together for your legislative summit here in DC. Please feel free to come visit us at the Embassy of Tribal Nations. We are up here at 1516 Peace Street Northwest. We would love to find ways to support state, tribal, and county relations, and to really collaborate on some of these cross-cutting policy issues. So without further ado, we will be in contact with you, and make sure that everyone receives a link to the live recording and also to the slides from today. So we wish you all well. Take care.